have the great privilege today of speaking with Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein of Jordan, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. High Commissioner, you've had a long and distinguished diplomatic career in various aspects for your country, for the international system. You find yourself now as High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. Is the job tougher or easier or just what you expected?
No, it's significantly tougher than I thought.
Why?
Because the problems we face are so immense. The numbers of people who suffer grievously as a result of the actions of extremist groups, terrorists certainly, but also the actions of governments who are actively trying to defend their peoples, but in ways that we see unfortunate because they make a huge dent on human rights. And we see more and more, or let's say we see in more and more countries the space for dissent shrinking, civil society unable to express its feelings like it should do, unable to exercise the freedom of expression, assembly, peaceful assembly and association. And that points to a very worrisome future. And we think that the power and potency of civil society has now proven itself to the point where governments are pushing back. And where is it leading us to? Is it leading us into a world where we will see rights again stifled by dictatorships and highly repressive regimes, basically in a preponderance in terms of the countries around the world? I'm very fearful for it. And like that, it's a very tough job.
So the United Nations is composed of literally nations, and yet as High Commissioner for Human Rights, you're in some respects charged with implementing or advocating for universal values of individuals. That must bring you into conflict to a certain extent with national governments.
Oh, all the time, all the time. I mean, what's so interesting is that you have many governments contest this notion that rights are universal. But you never really hear it from the victims. When I travel the world over, I meet with victims' associations and victims directly of torture, of abuses, violence, sexual violence, for instance. And you never hear them say that they support a traditional practice or a customary practice. For them, the rights that should be upheld, or the obligations that should be upheld by governments in respect of them, need to be met by the governments in question. And so there's no doubting that they are universal. And our exposure to human suffering really on a daily basis reinforces that point.
You've been in the job since 2014. What are the major issues that you've been grappling with?
Well, again, it's the rise and sort of the inability of the international community to put an end to extremist violence, the wars that seem to be accumulating at a rate faster than we are able to resolve. Some of them are slow burning sort of crises that we can't seem to check, like in Burundi most especially, but elsewhere as well. And we see migration on a scale which requires global action. We haven't seen that yet. It's being dealt with sort of piecemeal. We need to see much greater resettlement on the part of countries that some of them are becoming extremely mean-spirited, and we regret that. The world in the next 10 years cannot be a world of fences and barbed wire and machine gun nests where you don't have the free movement of peoples and goods. You might have financial transactions conducted in a fraction of a second, but the world may be heading back to some darker period of the 20th century, and clearly this is of great concern to me and my office.
You, not just professionally, but personally, you're a deeply civilized man. The region that you are, that you come from, seems to be collapsing to a certain extent into barbarism. And Jordan is beset with refugees, and the crisis in Syria and Iraq, the rise of ISIS is spreading around the region. What is the future of the Middle East?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I ask that question when I'm conducting the interviews or being asked in Arabic, the same point. It's destination unknown, largely. We see some areas of promise, but weighed against a background or racked with violence and and denial of rights on a massive scale, it really causes us very deep worry. And these are trajectories which we see elsewhere. Every year in September, I enumerate the number of countries, as I said, who are putting extraordinary pressure on civil society. And this year, for the first time, I couldn't name the number of countries simply because there were too many. There were too many parts of the world, including the MENA region, where that is the case. And if you don't have civil society, which is your principal antidote against extremism, where you can have the bubbling and the effervescence from the exchange of ideas, you are left with a very crude binary situation of a government that's bent on attacking the extremists and the extremists doing likewise, and the people in the middle suffer grievously as a result. And it's of course leaves us terrified to a certain extent of what may come in the future beyond already the horrors that we've already seen, as you've alluded to.
You were instrumental in helping to create the International Criminal Court. It's been in operation now. Do you see over the course of your career advances in international law, the liberal order, the system more generally, or stagnation or even backward progress?
Well, it has to happen. I mean, the alternative is that we, after a long peace, i.e. a peace devoid of a world war, so we're 70 years pushing on, it may not last, again, simply because the aggregate of the crises we see makes it almost impossible for us to untangle them and then resolve them in the way that we should be, at the speed that we should be. And unless we put our faith and our support into these institutions, I really fear that the next century or this century will be as bloody as the past, even worse perhaps. And so this is a court which has to be supported.
You are the High Commissioner for Human Rights. There's also a Commissioner for Refugees. Often the refugee issue is driven by human rights concerns.
Yes.
Do you work closely, and is something like this, the plight of Syria and the plight of the refugees from Syria, is that something on which you coordinate with other departments?
Yes, we work closely with Antonio Guterres, who's now nearing his term, and Filippo Grandi is someone who we all know very well. He having served, of course, in the High Commissioner's office as a deputy previously. We do work closely. Of course, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is principally dealing with the 1951 Refugee Convention. We not just cover those people, we cover all people, including migrants of irregular status, because all of them have their human rights. All should be dignified by a human rights-based approach when they at points of reception, when they're looking at being registered, and all too often we see too many places, processing centers, as centers for abuse, and where migrants and refugees are all too often abused in ways which really are unbecoming of the states that are receiving them. And again, there's a sort of a mean-spiritedness about it in many parts of the world, which really is quite worrisome. Not in this age, you would think. You know, in this age, we need to take stock of the traumas of the past, the disasters of the past, so as to better inform the decisions of today. If we're going to set course to a future that is somewhat better than it has been in earlier times.
You've been a national diplomat, had a distinguished career working on behalf of Jordan. You're now an international diplomat working on behalf of the UN system and the international community at large. What is the difference in perspective between the national jobs and the international jobs?
It's funny you should say that. I just had a meeting with a number of member states, and I said to them how I sometimes look back at my previous job and think, my God, I only had one country to worry about at the time. Isn't that fantastic? Now I have 193 to be concerned about. No, it's a very different job, and it's a hard job. But what gives me, and I have to say, sometimes I feel that I'm almost like a fraud when I sit with victims of torture, the families of the disappeared, and I think, who am I kidding? Can I expect through speeches and interviews and reports, will I bring these people's relatives, sons and daughters back to them? Will the healing on the part of those who've been tortured somehow feel better? I have to be careful that I'm not sort of delusional about what it is that one can do in this post. But what really gives one enormous motivation is the courage of the human rights defenders. You know, Gideon, there are not that many people, you would think, that would forfeit everything that they have and hold dear to themselves, you know, whether it be their families, their job, where they live, for the sake of making a point and standing up on principle, and then risk long terms of imprisonment or even worse. And yet, it's quite the opposite. There are more people than you think who would do that. I mean, it's phenomenal how courageous these people are. And so I think all those who work with me in the office, we believe that if they can do this, then surely we can be courageous too and speak out to governments and tell them that it's not all right to torture your people. It's not all right to abuse them in the way that you do. And so, of course, it's a tough job, but we're motivated by those who show more courage than I think many of us would otherwise show in those same circumstances.
So it's the local activists who give you the hope and inspiration to keep on going in some respects.
It's amazing. I met one fellow who came to see me with his wife and 2 children, and he had been in and out of jail in the country that he comes from. He said to me, "I'm the last surviving independent NGO." And he said, "The next time I go in, I may never come out." And I said, "Are you still willing to speak out?" And he said, "Yes." And he, very unassuming, gentle man. And again, it pushed, made the point, it's all right in countries where you know you have the protections of the law to speak out. But in countries where you don't, and you're still prepared to speak out, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's just so inspirational.
What can ordinary citizens, not governments, not government officials, not the local activists on the ground in crisis areas, but what can ordinary citizens of other countries do? They hear you talk about these issues, they read the papers, they feel great concern. Is there anything ordinary citizens can do to help the problem?
Well, it's, Antonio Guterres and I had a discussion on this, and I said to him, Antonio, in certain countries the repression is so bad. Why is it that people are not out demonstrating and expressing their feelings and so forth? And he said to me, you would expect that in many countries, but he said sometimes what happens is that a sort of depression, a mass depression sets in, and people become so despondent, they believe that the conditions will never change, they're immutable, and they just leave. And indeed, that's what we see happening in parts of the world where you think that the state of the country is such that there will be a reaction. It doesn't happen. I think what it seems to be the key is that you need almost natural leaders around whom people will coalesce, and the message and the messenger fuse. And I think in many countries it's a matter of finding the right people who will express the sentiments of many in conditions where otherwise you may not find that public expression. And we look out to national human rights institutions and to activists. But to your point, every individual can make a contribution. Every individual has their inalienable rights. Every individual should know that, and then should together with others, speak where they feel that those rights are being denied them.
Zeid, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.